All right, so for this message, I'm going to answer the question, why have a marriage habit? Now, the problem that we're trying to solve is one that hopefully most people are aware of. But as you'll see, just being aware of the problem doesn't really necessarily mean you fix it. Most people know the stat that 50% of marriages, including those of Christians, end in divorce. And that means there's probably a higher percentage of total marriages that, for at least a long period of time, or at least a period of time, are just totally unhappy. And so that's a problem. And hopefully it's a problem that you relate to, that you think, that's not what I want. In fact, I would say that everybody who had that problem to the point that they got divorced recognize they don't want to get divorced. That was a problem that they did not want to experience. But the underlying problem is, despite nobody signing up for marriage with the plan or the intent or the possibility of getting divorced or being unhappy as a result of the marriage, nobody plans this. It still happens. Nobody wants this to happen, and it still happens. And so I think that's the problem. The problem is, we know we don't want to experience this negative thing in our marriage, but we do it anyway. Isn't that strange? And you could say that's this case of all things in the human condition. Oh, we know that we should eat well. We know we should exercise. We know we should be constantly saving. We know we should be getting enough sleep. But oftentimes we don't do what we know we should do. We do what we know we shouldn't do. But hidden underneath this, which I think is important to uncover why this problem repeats itself, is there's an implicit lie. If you ask somebody who does seem to have a great marriage, or you go on Twitter, or you read blogs or podcasts, oftentimes the solution to the problem is somewhere in this camp. Just forgive more. Just say I love you. Just remember it's not 50-50. It's 100%. They're things they say, if you do these things that promote a good marriage, you'll have a good marriage. Don't argue. Or if you argue, argue well. Fight fair. And there's a lot of aspirational content, a good number of it is geared towards one spouse or the other. Hey, be positive towards them, be loving, be forgiving. And those things, while they're not wrong, if they're common knowledge, and yet people are still experiencing this pain, this problem, there's probably somewhere a lack of total truth. See, a lie isn't just a bald-faced, hey, this is untrue. No one would say saying I love you more regularly, having a date night regularly, is a lie, is bad. It's a lie when, in totality, those things that if you were to do, the marks of what makes a good marriage, that is common knowledge, if you do those things, but they really aren't what's going to lead to a good marriage, then in that regard, it's a lie. Because we see it as it's sufficient. And if we see something as sufficient and it's marketed to us as sufficient, it may be true, it may be necessary, or it may be helpful. But if it's not sufficient, it's effectively a lie. So doing all these good things towards your spouse, being the best person at all times to your spouse, those are good things to do. But clearly, they're not sufficient, because that's what the common knowledge, common wisdom about what makes a great marriage to be. And it's not working. So guess what? This actually results in a far deeper pain. The first is, well, I can't do all those things, so I must be messed up, or my spouse must be messed up because I don't feel I want to do those things for them. So therefore, it's not going to work. That's an implicit lie, and that creates a far greater pain of helplessness, blaming, and shaming. That's what creates a deeper pain. And I would say that's actually what we see in the Bible, that some of this behavior is actually the law. Do these things and you will be blessed. Right? We don't fight it because it's true. We want to be more loving and forgiving and more consistent in our marriages. And there's tons of Twitter and podcasts that will say, do these things. Men, man up, be more loving, be more sacrificial. And you should be. And we would seem, if we could do it perfectly as described, then we would have a good marriage. But that's the law. Right? If we could perfectly follow God's laws, which this falls under, then we would enjoy our time with Him. We would be righteous in front of Him. But the pain is, if it's sold as the truth and we fall short, then the pain is immense when it comes to our marriage or comes to our righteousness as well. So if that's the pain, though, what is the place that everyone wants to get? And most people kind of have a sense of what part of that promised land is for a marriage, right? It is one that is more joyful, more loving, not a sense of loneliness, a greater sense of fulfillment. But I think somewhere within this, we've lost a sense of what the promised land really can be, because we're grounding ourselves in the law. But that's achievable when we do all these things correctly. And I think the promised land really is, but there's some things that recognize we can't be the perfect wife or husband, and yet we still have a near perfect relationship. That to me is a better picture of the promised land. And it certainly is the picture of the Bible. God offers us His promised land, even though we fall way short of what He actually expects as a standard for us to get there. He says, yeah, we will not be able to do this. So therefore, I'm going to have somebody come here to pay that price for you. And so that's the promised land that comes through grace. And therein lies part of the solution, which is what I call the habit. Now, habits sound like it falls in the legalistic part, right? You have to have a good habit of going to the gym, brushing your teeth, drinking a lot of water, whatever that habit is. And so I recognize that there's some sort of like tension here of what is legalistic versus what is grace. But what I mean to say is a habit is not about the perfection. This habit that I'm proposing is one that allows us to identify our flaws together and work on them together, to work proactively to heal a marriage, because it presumes the marriage is going to start experience breakage. From the moment two people who have their own stuff come together under one household, I call it the point of the boiling frog. You're in a pot, there's water, and someone has turned on the stove, but you don't know it yet. It's just you can't tell. But we all know how the story ends. Eventually it gets hot enough where the frog dies. And in many ways, that's what a marriage is. You kind of get in there. But from the moment two people with their own junk get into the marriage, they don't even see it. They're not even aware of it. So this is where my solution, that's different from the common knowledge of be the best person now, live your best life now, be the perfect husband or wife. You almost have to be a spiritual giant to do so many of the things that are advocated online and through the general media to have a great marriage. And mine is actually slightly different. It's presuming you're going to mess up. And this habit is bringing forth to you together so that you're not pointing fingers at one another what it is to make the marriage better. And that context is the Word. Now, someone may say, oh, but that's been advice all along, pray together, read the Bible together. And, I'm saying those things are good, but not sufficient. The insight I had is those things are good, but sometimes we need more guidance in what the scriptures are and the intention behind these scriptures. Many times, the scriptures are for us to understand God and promote our closeness to Him, our knowledge of Him, our devotion and obedience to Him. And you could say, by virtue of that, it should affect your marriage. And I would say, in an ideal world, that is probably very true. But I think the reality is sometimes we need something a little bit more intentional that draws from actual experience or science or research on what are the issues in a marriage, and let's be proactive about them. And so that's where I came up with this daily habit of devotions based on my own experience of reading and just in my own marriage, realizing, I wish we had tackled that issue sooner. I wish that we had a scripture-led conversation around this topic way earlier in our marriage. And here's the other part, with much greater frequency. So here are the elements of what I've put together. First one, I love the concept of devotionals because it's daily. Before, with my marriage, I put a 90-day checkpoint with our marriage coach, our marriage pastor. And I thought, okay, great. Every 90 days, we're going to come in, check in, talk about what's going on, help us course correct. And it was mostly good, but we still ended up hitting very, very difficult times because that 90-day stretch, a lot could happen. And then just spending that 1 hour talking about stuff that happened in the previous 90 days that we need to address, and then waiting another 90 days, it just wasn't great. So one is you have the 90 days, when you hit a tough patch, immediately go into, okay, we're going to start dealing with this now, let's go weekly. And if I look back, I probably would have done that, might have addressed a lot of issues. But I thought even further, I said, you know what? Every single day, we should be much closer. The Psalm 119 says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me." So this daily process of being corrected and rebuked through Scripture is actually what I think is the right habit. And we'll talk about a little bit more what occurs in these devotions that slightly sets this apart from a generic devotion, why this is really why I think it's a great marriage habit. So our takeaway for this part is, hey, we need a habit, because the general problem is we know we want to have a great marriage, but despite knowing that, and despite all the common knowledge that's available from friends and families and the media, it's not working. And I think we want to start searching for a solution that really addresses it. And one of those is something that we do daily. So there's a habit that's daily, but specifically around our marriage, long before we have the problems. So I'll go into a little more detail in the next episode around what makes content great for this daily habit.